She was humiliated at check-in. Moments later, they begged for mercy. A first-class ticket. A routine flight. A woman who earned her place at the top. But at this airport, power doesn't come from money, it comes from perception. And when Danielle Robinson steps up to the priority check-in counter, one man decides she doesn't belong. Not because of rules, not because of a mistake, but because he thinks he can. What happens next? A battle of arrogance versus authority. Ego versus real power. A moment that should have been small, but turns into a storm no one saw coming. By the time this plane takes off, careers will be ruined, secrets exposed, and Danielle Robinson will prove one thing. They picked the wrong woman to underestimate. Do you believe in karma? What would you have done in her place? Comment below. And if you love seeing justice served with twists you never expect, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because this is just the beginning. What if the person you humiliated turned out to be the one signing your paycheck? What if, in your moment of arrogance, you were unknowingly sealing your own fate? The automatic doors of JFK Airport slid open with a whisper, welcoming Danielle Robinson into the chaotic symphony of rushing travelers, rolling suitcases, and distant boarding announcements. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sterile chill of air conditioning as she stepped inside, her designer heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Danielle was a woman who commanded respect, not through loud proclamations or ostentatious displays of wealth, but through an air of quiet authority. Dressed in a tailored cream coat draped over a silk blouse, she moved with the ease of someone accustomed to first-class lounges and private boardrooms. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her leather suitcase as she approached the priority check-in counter. This was supposed to be a seamless process, a routine step before boarding the flight that would take her to the final negotiation of a multi-million-dollar acquisition. The culmination of years of work, sacrifice, and strategic maneuvering. But as she stepped up to the counter, she saw the smirk. The young man behind the desk, his name tag reading Carter, didn't even attempt to mask the condescension in his gaze. It was subtle but unmistakable, the way his eyes flicked over her, his smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth, as if she were an anomaly. A disruption in his perception of what a first-class passenger should look like. Danielle had seen it before. She knew this game. "Good morning," she said, sliding her passport and ticket across the counter, her voice smooth and composed. Carter took the documents with a deliberate slowness, barely glancing at them before cocking an eyebrow. "This line is for priority check-in," he said, enunciating the words as if explaining them to a child. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Danielle held his gaze, unflinching. "Quite sure," she replied, her smile not faltering. Carter hummed, flipping open the passport with exaggerated care. This doesn't seem right." A long, deliberate pause as he tapped at his keyboard, his fingers moving slower than necessary. Around them, other passengers were checked in swiftly, their interactions lasting no more than a minute. But Danielle was made to wait. Another pause. Then Carter leaned back, sighing theatrically. "I'm sorry, but this ticket doesn't look valid. Are you sure you booked it through the airline?" The sheer audacity of the question was almost amusing. Danielle exhaled through her nose, steadying the flicker of irritation curling at the edges of her patience. She had no intention of creating a scene, but she also had no intention of being dismissed. "Yes," she said evenly. "I booked it directly. Perhaps you should double-check." Carter didn't even try to hide his smirk now. He tapped furiously at the keyboard, then leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to feign discretion. "You know, it's not uncommon for people to mistake their ticket class. Happens all the time." A polite way of saying, "You don't belong here." Danielle's grip tightened on her suitcase handle. Years of navigating spaces where she was not expected to belong had trained her in restraint. She would not raise her voice. She would not demand. She would simply hold him accountable. "I'd suggest," she said, her tone smooth but carrying an undeniable weight, "that you be very sure about how you proceed next." Carter blinked. For the first time, his smirk faltered. But then, as if realizing he was being challenged, he straightened and gestured toward a nearby security guard. "I'm going to need to verify this with management," he announced loudly, making sure the passengers nearby could hear. Danielle didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, retrieving her phone. One call, a single number dialed. The response was immediate. "It's me," she said, her voice low but firm. "We have a situation." She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket as she met Carter's gaze once more. He had no idea what he had just set into motion. Danielle Robinson was not a woman used to waiting. Her life was built on precision, efficiency, and calculated moves, a symphony of control that had carried her to the top. But as she stood at the priority check-in counter, watching Carter Miller take his sweet time, she recognized the game he was playing. And it was amateur hour. Carter hadn't outright refused her check-in. Not yet. Instead, he leaned into the role of a dedicated employee, furrowing his brow as he tapped at his keyboard with exaggerated slowness. His eyes flicked up to her every few seconds, amusement dancing behind his false concern. Danielle remained still. She had patience when it counted. The seconds stretched. Then a full minute. Then another. Behind her, a man in a business suit cleared his throat impatiently, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Danielle didn't move. She wouldn't give Carter the satisfaction of appearing rattled. Finally, Carter sighed dramatically. "Well," he said, shaking his head as he continued typing nonsense. "This is odd." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "What exactly is odd?" Carter clicked his tongue, tilting his head slightly. "Your ticket isn't pulling up quite right. Maybe a system error. Happens sometimes." A blatant lie. Danielle knew airline systems well. If there was an actual issue, he would have flagged it immediately. This was a stall, an attempt to waste her time, to test her patience. She refused to play. "I see," she said coolly. "Then check again." Carter grinned as if she had fallen right into his trap. He tapped another few keys, this time without even looking at the screen, then let out a long breath. "I might have to call someone," he mused, "just to confirm a few things." Danielle kept her expression neutral. "By all means." Carter's smirk faltered just slightly at her unwavering tone, but he quickly recovered. He turned away, pressing a single button on his phone, a meaningless gesture, considering Danielle could see the screen and nothing had changed. Then, after a long, unnecessary pause, he straightened and gestured toward a nearby security guard. Danielle didn't react, but she noted the way his smirk widened just a little. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The security guard approached, his presence adding an extra layer of scrutiny to the moment. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the casual authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. Carter leaned toward him, lowering his voice just enough that it seemed confidential, but not so much that Danielle couldn't hear. "We've got a little issue," Carter said smoothly, casting a quick glance at her. "Passenger's ticket isn't coming up in the system. Thought it might be best to have someone verify." The guard's posture shifted slightly, his eyes flickering to Danielle with mild suspicion. Danielle could see it happening in real time, Carter feeding him a narrative, subtly twisting reality just enough to cast doubt. The guard turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have proof of purchase?" Danielle tilted her head. "The ticket in his hand is proof of purchase." Carter chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if to say, "See what I'm dealing with? I'm sure it's just a mix-up," he said lightly. "But, we have protocols." Danielle exhaled slowly. The crowd behind her had started paying attention now. Whispers moved through the line, subtle but present. She caught fragments. Maybe she's confused about her ticket. Happens all the time. You'd think people would check these things beforehand. A familiar tune. But Danielle wasn't confused. She was watching Carter very carefully now, studying him in the same way she studied business rivals before taking them apart piece by piece. And Carter had no idea he was being dissected. Danielle adjusted her silk scarf with deliberate calm. Then, with a quiet authority that made both men pause, she said, "Call your supervisor." Carter blinked. The cocky amusement in his expression flickered for the first time. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary," he said quickly. "I'm sure we can." I wasn't asking, Danielle cut in. A shift in the atmosphere. The guard hesitated. Carter's grip on her ticket tightened slightly. The pieces were moving now. Danielle didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue. She simply needed to remind them of the weight in her words. And if they still thought this was a game, well, they were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. Chapter 3. Humiliation in the Open. Danielle Robinson was no stranger to scrutiny. She had spent years navigating spaces where she wasn't expected to belong, where her presence alone was enough to make people second-guess her worth. But this was deliberate. The moment Carter called security, the shift was immediate. Passengers in line paused mid-conversation, some turning to watch the unfolding situation with thinly veiled interest. A few exchanged glances, subtle but unmistakable, a silent agreement that something was off about her presence here. Carter fed into it, soaking up the attention like a performer stepping onto a stage. He hadn't just questioned her ticket, he had invited an audience. Danielle saw it happen in real time. The way whispers spread like wildfire. What's going on? Did she try to cut the line? I bet she booked economy and thought she could get away with it. The security guard standing beside Carter didn't say anything outright, but his posture shifted, his stance now one of casual authority, as if he was preparing for an incident. Danielle remained composed, but she felt the weight of every stare, the undercurrent of assumptions filling the space like a thick fog. Carter, sensing the momentum shifting in his favor, leaned into it. "Well, you know," he said, his voice suddenly louder, more performative, "we have protocols for situations like this." His tone was just careful enough, not outright accusatory, but dripping with implication. Danielle didn't react, but her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her suitcase. Situations like this. She knew exactly what he meant. A few passengers chuckled under their breath. A woman in a navy blue pantsuit, standing a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Danielle and Carter. She looked like she wanted to say something, to intervene, maybe, but instead, she looked back down at her phone. That was always the way of it. People saw the injustice, but very few ever stepped forward to stop it. Carter, now fully enjoying himself, tapped at his keyboard once more, shaking his head dramatically. "Yeah," he mused, dragging out the words. "This just isn't adding up. And, we have to be extra careful these days. We can't just let anyone waltz into priority check-in without verifying things first." Anyone. Another loaded word, laced with the same unspoken message. Someone in line exhaled loudly, as if annoyed by the inconvenience of her presence. Another man, middle-aged, wearing an expensive watch, clicked his tongue impatiently, muttering something about people wasting time. And then, Carter went for the final touch. "I mean," he said, turning to the security guard now, "we've had cases of ticket fraud before. You remember that guy last month? Thought he could just print out a fake pass and walk right in." The guard nodded slowly, now fully playing into Carter's game. Danielle exhaled through her nose, controlled and measured. She could feel the narrative shifting beneath her feet, like quicksand. Carter wasn't just questioning her ticket anymore. He was shaping a story, and the passengers were eager to believe it. A woman a few rows back leaned toward her companion, whispering loudly enough to be heard. "She doesn't look first class." That one landed. Danielle kept her face neutral, but something inside her hardened. Carter, sensing victory, sighed theatrically. "Well," he said, straightening, "we're going to have to handle this properly. I'll need to call a manager. You understand, of course." Of course. Danielle Robinson understood perfectly. She had seen this tactic in boardrooms, at social events, in every elite space where people like Carter thrived on thinly veiled superiority. They never said it outright. They never had to. She felt the shift now. The once neutral passengers had begun subtly siding with Carter, not because they had facts, but because the story made sense to them. She didn't fit their mental image of wealth, of status, of belonging. And that was enough. Carter, enjoying the undercurrent of approval, now looked at Danielle directly. Not as an employee handling a passenger issue, but as a man who believed he had won. "So," he said, mocking politeness, "do you have any additional proof that this ticket belongs to you?" The final humiliation. A demand for proof of belonging. Danielle didn't flinch, didn't react. She simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Carter's. Danielle Robinson was no stranger to scrutiny. She had spent years navigating spaces where she wasn't expected to belong, where her presence alone was enough to make people second-guess her worth. But this was deliberate. The moment Carter called security, the shift was immediate. Passengers in line paused mid-conversation, some turning to watch the unfolding situation with thinly veiled interest. A few exchanged glances, subtle but unmistakable, a silent agreement that something was off about her presence here. Carter fed into it, soaking up the attention like a performer stepping onto a stage. He hadn't just questioned her ticket, he had invited an audience. Danielle saw it happen in real time. The way whispers spread like wildfire. What's going on? Did she try to cut the line? I bet she booked economy and thought she could get away with it. The security guard standing beside Carter didn't say anything outright, but his posture shifted, his stance now one of casual authority, as if he was preparing for an incident. Danielle remained composed, but she felt the weight of every stare, the undercurrent of assumptions filling the space like a thick fog. Carter, sensing the momentum shifting in his favor, leaned into it. "Well, you know," he said, his voice suddenly louder, more performative, "we have protocols for situations like this." His tone was just careful enough, not outright accusatory, but dripping with implication. Danielle didn't react, but her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her suitcase. Situations like this. She knew exactly what he meant. A few passengers chuckled under their breath. A woman in a navy blue pantsuit, standing a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Danielle and Carter. She looked like she wanted to say something, to intervene, maybe, but instead, she looked back down at her phone. That was always the way of it. People saw the injustice, but very few ever stepped forward to stop it. Carter, now fully enjoying himself, tapped at his keyboard once more, shaking his head dramatically. "Yeah," he mused, dragging out the words. "This just isn't adding up. And, you know, we have to be extra careful these days. We can't just let anyone waltz into priority check-in without verifying things first." Anyone. Another loaded word, laced with the same unspoken message. Someone in line exhaled loudly, as if annoyed by the inconvenience of her presence. Another man, middle-aged, wearing an expensive watch, clicked his tongue impatiently, muttering something about people wasting time. And then, Carter went for the final touch. "I mean," he said, turning to the security guard now, "we've had cases of ticket fraud before. You remember that guy last month? Thought he could just print out a fake pass and walk right in." The guard nodded slowly, now fully playing into Carter's game. Danielle exhaled through her nose, controlled and measured. She could feel the narrative shifting beneath her feet, like quicksand. Carter wasn't just questioning her ticket anymore. He was shaping a story, and the passengers were eager to believe it. A woman a few rows back leaned toward her companion, whispering loudly enough to be heard. "She doesn't look first class." That one landed. Danielle kept her face neutral, but something inside her hardened. Carter, sensing victory, sighed theatrically. "Well," he said, straightening, "we're going to have to handle this properly. I'll need to call a manager. You understand, of course." Of course. Danielle Robinson understood perfectly. She had seen this tactic in boardrooms, at social events, in every elite space where people like Carter thrived on thinly veiled superiority. They never said it outright. They never had to. She felt the shift now. The once neutral passengers had begun subtly siding with Carter, not because they had facts, but because the story made sense to them. She didn't fit their mental image of wealth, of status, of belonging. And that was enough. Carter, enjoying the undercurrent of approval, now looked at Danielle directly. Not as an employee handling a passenger issue, but as a man who believed he had won. "So," he said, mocking politeness, "do you have any additional proof that this ticket belongs to you?" The final humiliation. A demand for proof of belonging. Danielle didn't flinch, didn't react. She simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Carter's. And in that moment, something in his smirk faltered, just barely. Because for the first time since this encounter started, Carter had missed something crucial. Danielle Robinson wasn't playing his game. She was waiting for the moment to reveal who she really was. But not yet. Not yet. Danielle Robinson had been patient. She had stood her ground as Carter Miller played his little game, as he dragged out the process, enjoying every second of his power trip. She had watched as he called security, knowing full well that he had no reason to. She had listened as the whispers around her turned from curiosity to thinly veiled contempt. She had let it happen, because Danielle knew something Carter didn't. But now he was getting bold, and bold men always made mistakes. The security guard took a deliberate step forward, positioning himself just close enough to make a statement. He didn't ask questions. He didn't clarify what the situation was. Instead, he placed himself between Danielle and the counter, a silent declaration of where he stood. His presence loomed. A subtle, but clear message. Step back. You don't belong here. Carter smirked, barely hiding his satisfaction. Look, he said, sighing theatrically. I get it. Mistakes happen. But if you can't prove you have a first-class ticket, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. Danielle didn't move. The smirk widened. Oh, don't get me wrong, Carter continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. I'd love to help, but we have policies. We have to protect our real priority passengers. Real. The word hung in the air, as sharp as a blade. The tension cracked. A man behind her, impatient, entitled, exhaled loudly. For God's sake, just let them check your ticket properly or get out of the way. A woman in heels muttered to her companion, shaking her head. This is what happens when they try to cheat the system. Danielle had heard enough. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase, not in anger, but in control. She had expected this. The narrative had been set the moment Carter laid eyes on her. But now they were giving her everything she needed. Carter crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. So, do you have any proof? Danielle held his gaze for a long, measured moment. Then, with deliberate calm, she spoke. I don't need to prove anything to you. Carter blinked. The guard shifted uncomfortably. The passengers, the staff, the bystanders, they were all watching now. And for the first time, the energy shifted. Something was off. Something about the way she said it. Carter, for all his arrogance, felt it. A warning he was too blind to recognize. But it was already too late. Danielle Robinson had seen enough incompetent men to recognize one on sight. The moment Greg Bradley arrived at the scene, she knew exactly what kind of manager he was. A company man. A yes man. A man who never made real decisions, only followed the lead of whoever gave him the easiest path to self-preservation. And right now, that person was Carter Miller. Bradley approached with calculated slowness, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't here to assess the situation. He was here to back up his employee. The moment Carter saw him, his smirk returned full force. Ah, perfect timing, sir, Carter said, stepping aside like he was handing off a nuisance. We've got a bit of an issue. He didn't even try to hide his amusement. Danielle knew exactly what Carter was thinking. Now, she has to listen. Now, she's outnumbered. Bradley clasped his hands in front of him, offering a tight, forced smile. Ma'am, he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. I understand there's some confusion regarding your ticket? Danielle tilted her head slightly. There's no confusion on my end. The words hit their mark. For a split second, Bradley hesitated. But he recovered quickly. Well, you see, these things happen. System errors, misunderstandings. I'm sure we can clear this up. Danielle said nothing. Carter, taking the silence as victory, pounced. You know, he mused, tapping a finger against the counter. Just to be extra careful, maybe we should do a quick security check. The air shifted. Danielle felt it immediately. So did the passengers watching. The way Carter said it, casual, light-hearted, like it was nothing, but everyone knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't about her ticket anymore. It was about painting a picture. And Carter? He was an artist of humiliation. The security guard, who had remained silent up until now, stiffened slightly. Even he knew that this was pushing it. But Bradley didn't object. Because of course he didn't. Carter, seeing no resistance, pressed on. I mean, you never know these days, he continued. Smiling like this was just casual conversation. It's always better to be safe, right? A few passengers murmured in agreement. And just like that, with a few words and a well-placed smirk, Carter had done it. He had turned Danielle Robinson from an inconvenience into a suspect. Danielle Robinson had never been afraid of powerful men. She had sat across from billionaires in high-stakes negotiations, walked into boardrooms where she was the only woman, the only black executive, the only one who wasn't supposed to be there, and she had left those rooms victorious. But this was different. Because this wasn't about business, intelligence, or merit. This was about control. And Carter Miller? He wanted to break her down. The moment he suggested a security check, the tension in the air shifted. Passengers who had only been mildly curious before were now openly watching, judging, waiting to see what happened next. Carter knew this. He thrived on it. And now, he was doubling down. A second employee, standing a few feet behind the counter, hesitated before leaning toward Carter, lowering his voice just enough to sound discreet, but not enough that Danielle couldn't hear. "Do you think we should call security?" The words landed like a gunshot. The passengers in line stiffened. The security guard's expression darkened slightly, his stance becoming more assertive. The whispers swelled. Why would they need security? Maybe she really did something. She's acting too calm. People who are innocent usually get defensive, right? Danielle remained still, her fingers wrapped around the handle of her suitcase. Her heartbeat steady, her expression unchanged. But inside, she was taking notes. Carter, now fully in performance mode, sighed loudly, making a show of considering the suggestion. Then, as if reaching a reluctant conclusion, he turned back to Danielle with an exaggerated look of polite regret. "Listen," he said, speaking slowly, deliberately, as if talking to a child. "I'm really trying to help here, but at this point, I need you to." He paused, then smiled. "Prove it." Danielle didn't react. Carter's grin widened. "Your ticket, your first-class booking," he continued. "Show me something that proves you actually paid for it." A beat of silence. "And otherwise," he said, his voice carrying across the terminal, "I'll have to assume this ticket is fraudulent." Danielle recognized the strategy immediately. It wasn't about verifying her information. He had never been interested in that. It was about forcing her to justify herself, to perform innocence, to scramble for his approval. And the moment she played along, the moment she gave in and tried to prove herself, she would have already lost. Because men like Carter Miller didn't want proof. They wanted submission. The crowd was watching now, waiting for her to panic, to defend, to beg. And Carter? He was standing there, arms crossed, smug and victorious, waiting for her to crack. But Danielle Robinson didn't crack. She simply breathed in, then out. Then, slowly, deliberately, she smiled. Carter Miller was still smiling. The kind of smile a man wore when he thought he had one. Danielle Robinson watched him closely, memorizing every detail. The arrogance in his stance, the way his arms remained folded, the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. He had built this moment carefully, brick by brick, whisper by whisper, assumption by assumption, until it became undeniable truth in the minds of everyone watching. She was a fraud, a troublemaker, someone who didn't belong in his world of first-class lounges and priority check-ins. And he believed it so deeply that he had made a critical mistake. He had forgotten to ask who she really was. The air was thick with anticipation. Passengers watched, waiting for Danielle to fold, to stammer, to panic, to scramble for proof. Even Greg Bradley, the weak-willed airport manager, stood with expectant patience, as if he were indulging a child who simply didn't understand the rules. But Danielle did nothing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. The movement was slow, deliberate, and it sent a ripple through the space. She didn't look at Carter. She didn't look at Bradley. She barely even looked at the security guard, whose stance had shifted just slightly. No longer fully confident, now uncertain. Instead, she brought the phone to her ear. A single ring, then another, and then, "It's me." The voice on the other end responded immediately. No pleasantries, no questions, just readiness. Danielle's voice remained calm, composed. "It's time." She hung up, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and turned to Carter, and smiled. Carter's smirk flickered, just for a fraction of a second, but Danielle saw it. He felt it, even if he didn't understand why yet. She had given nothing away, but there was something different now, something shifting beneath his feet. Danielle could see the calculations in his eyes, the small hint of confusion as he tried to decide what she had just done. Had she called someone? A lawyer? A friend to bail her out? Someone who could plead her case? His smirk returned, but it wasn't as strong as before. "All right, well," he said, forcing a chuckle. "If you don't have proof, we'll have to." He stopped, because at that moment, two men appeared in the terminal, walking toward the counter with purpose. Carter noticed them late, and when he did, his face twitched. They weren't security. They weren't police. They weren't random airline employees. They were different. Their suits were sharp, tailored, their movements quick but controlled, the kind of men who didn't waste time on trivial matters. The kind of men who didn't show up unless something was very, very wrong. Greg Bradley saw them too, and his entire posture changed. His arms, which had been lazily crossed, immediately dropped to his sides. His expression, once filled with apathetic boredom, shifted into something that resembled fear, because he recognized them. And that meant Carter was already in trouble. The taller of the two men reached the counter first. His jaw was tight, his movements sharp, and when he looked at Carter, his eyes held no patience. "Which one of you is Carter Miller?" The smirk was gone now. Carter swallowed once before straightening his posture. "That would be me." The man didn't offer a greeting, didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "Step away from the counter. Now." Carter blinked. "Wait, The second man finally spoke, this one shorter but broader, his voice low and clipped. "You don't want to argue. Step away." Danielle watched Carter carefully. For the first time today, he was on the receiving end of power, and he didn't know what to do with it. Carter Miller's entire world tilted in an instant. Just moments ago, he had been untouchable, the undisputed authority behind the check-in counter, the gatekeeper of privilege, the man who decided who belonged and who didn't. And now, he was staring at two men in tailored suits who looked at him like he was already a dead man walking. The taller of the two executives took a single step forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Carter like a predator sizing up prey. "Step away from the counter," he repeated, his voice low, measured, absolute. Carter's mouth opened, a weak attempt at protest forming on his tongue. Now. The word cut through the air like a blade, and Carter obeyed. For the first time today, he obeyed. Danielle Robinson watched it all without a word, her hand still resting lightly on the handle of her suitcase, her expression unreadable. She could feel it now, the energy shift in the terminal, the confusion spreading like wildfire. Passengers who had once whispered about her were now silent, their curiosity turning into uncertainty. Greg Bradley, the pathetic excuse for a manager, took a small, instinctive step backward, his fingers twitching at his sides. He didn't understand what was happening yet, but he knew enough to be afraid. The second executive, the shorter, broader one, finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of finality, the kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted to be obeyed. "Miss Robinson," he said, his expression unreadable. And then, he bowed his head. Slightly, respectfully, apologetically, and the room froze. Carter's breath hitched. His body stiffened. His brain refused to process what he had just heard. Miss Robinson? No, that wasn't right. That wasn't. His gaze snapped to Danielle, really looking at her for the first time. The effortless poise. The unshaken calm. The way she had never once panicked, even as he pushed and pushed, convinced that she was just another nobody trying to cheat the system. And now she was standing still, watching as two men who could end his career with a single sentence, bowed their heads to her. Greg Bradley looked like he had just swallowed glass. "Yes, sir," he stammered, glancing between the executives and Danielle. I don't understand." The taller executive barely spared him a glance. "You will," he said coolly. Then, turning his full attention back to Danielle, he straightened his posture, clasped his hands in front of him, and, in a voice that carried across the entire terminal, said, "On behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize, Chairwoman Robinson." The silence was deafening. Carter's vision blurred for a moment. His smug grin had vanished completely, replaced by a gaping expression of pure, unfiltered horror. "Chairwoman Robinson. Chairwoman Robinson." His lips parted, but no words came out. This couldn't be. "See, Chairwoman?" The word barely made it past his throat, his voice cracking. His legs felt weak. His hands, which had spent the last half hour waving away her authority, tightening around her ticket, and pointing her toward the exit, now hung uselessly at his sides. He had humiliated her. He had mocked her. And now, he was staring at the one person in this building who held more power than anyone else. The passengers, who had once been eager to judge, now looked as if they had just witnessed the execution of a man who didn't know he was already dead. The woman in the navy blue pantsuit, the one who had earlier averted her gaze, choosing silence over intervention, now covered her mouth with her hand, stunned into speechlessness. The man who had muttered about people wasting time had turned pale, suddenly fascinated with his shoes. Even the security guard, who had loomed over Danielle like an unshakable force, now looked lost, glancing at Bradley as if silently asking what the hell they had just done. Carter took a shaky step back, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in dry air. But no one was looking at him anymore. No one cared, because the only person that mattered here was Danielle Robinson. And she hadn't even spoken yet. She was just watching as the empire she controlled closed in around him. And for the first time since this had started, for the first time since he had smirked at her, mocked her, humiliated her in front of an audience, Carter Miller realized exactly how small he truly was. Carter Miller was drowning, and there was no one left to save him. He had spent the last 30 minutes reveling in his own arrogance, building up this moment, ensuring that Danielle Robinson was humiliated beyond repair. But now he was the one standing there, exposed, powerless, and utterly insignificant. And the worst part? No one was coming to his defense. Greg Bradley tried first, because of course he did. The manager, who had spent the entire confrontation standing idly by, now scrambled to regain control, but he didn't know where to begin. "Chairwoman Robinson," he stammered, his voice shaky but forced into polite professionalism. I assure you, this was all just a misunderstanding. If we had known who you were, He stopped, because the second those words left his mouth, he realized his mistake. And Danielle? She simply tilted her head, her gaze sharp as glass. "Oh," she said smoothly. "So it would have been different if you had known?" Bradley's face drained of color. I mean, that is to say." The taller executive, the one who had bowed his head to Danielle moments earlier, cut him off. "Greg," he said coldly, "shut up." The silence was merciless. Danielle could feel the weight of every eye on her, but she didn't react to the crowd. She only had one target left. And Carter Miller? He was visibly shaking. Danielle turned toward him, taking her time, her movements measured, precise, the kind of precision Carter had never seen before, because he had never been on this end of it. He opened his mouth, probably to beg, maybe to plead, but she spoke first. "Tell me something, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice calm, almost pleasant. Carter flinched. "Yes," he croaked. Danielle glanced toward the counter, then back at him. "How many passengers have you treated like this?" Carter froze, because there was no right answer. If he denied it, he would be lying. If he admitted it, he would be burying himself deeper. So instead, he stammered, trying to find words, any words. I was just following." Danielle didn't let him finish. "That's not what I asked." Carter visibly swallowed, his throat working as if he were trying to force down pure humiliation. I'll tell you what I think," Danielle said, tilting her head slightly. "I think this wasn't a mistake. I think you've done this plenty of times before, only this time, you picked the wrong person." Carter's face was deathly pale now. "Chairwoman, please." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Mr. Reed," she said, addressing the taller executive, "do you have the authority to make personnel decisions?" Reed didn't even hesitate. "Yes, Chairwoman." Danielle's eyes never left Carter's. "Good," she said smoothly. "Then fire him." Carter made a small, broken sound, like a man who had just been told the executioner's axe was already swinging. Bradley stepped forward instinctively, but the second executive, the broader, quieter one, simply raised a hand, silencing him. "This is insane," Carter choked out, his voice rising in pure desperation. "I was just doing my job. I didn't know." Danielle's expression didn't change. "But you did know," she said. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Carter shook his head violently, as if that would somehow change reality. I can fix this," he begged. No," Reed said, his voice cold, final. "You can't." And then, "Security," he called out. "Escort him out of the building." Carter made a sound that was half protest, half disbelief, his eyes darting between Reed, Bradley, and Danielle, as if hoping one of them would reverse the decision. But there was nothing left to say. Two security guards, the same ones Carter had once used as weapons against Danielle, now grabbed him by the arms. "Wait," he gasped. "Wait, please." But they were already pulling him away. And no one stopped them. Carter Miller was gone, dragged out of the terminal by the very security team he had once commanded with smug authority. But Danielle Robinson wasn't finished yet. Because while Carter had been the loudest, he wasn't the only problem. No, there was still Greg Bradley. The manager stood there, frozen, his face a mask of barely contained panic. He had spent the entire ordeal playing it safe, assuming that by standing on the sidelines, he could avoid accountability. But now, with Carter humiliated and discarded, all eyes had turned to him. And Danielle? Danielle wasn't done handing out justice. She turned her gaze toward him, slow and deliberate. "Mr. Bradley," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that left no room for argument. The man swallowed hard. "See Chairwoman Robinson," he stammered. I had no idea." Danielle raised a hand, and he immediately fell silent. "I have one question," she said, "and I suggest you answer carefully." Bradley nodded frantically, like a man about to be judged by the gods. Danielle took a measured step forward. "How long," she asked, "have you allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked?" The question hit the room like a thunderclap. It wasn't just about Carter anymore. It was about the entire culture of this place. The way Carter had felt comfortable enough to act the way he did. The way Bradley had stood by and done nothing. The way the passengers had assumed Danielle was the problem without hesitation. The silence that followed was unforgiving. Bradley's mouth opened and closed, his mind scrambling for a defense. No excuses," Danielle cut in smoothly. "You had a choice. You saw what was happening, and you let it continue. And I can only assume that means this isn't the first time." Bradley visibly deflated, his shoulders slumping. It was over. Danielle turned to Reed, the senior executive who had stepped in earlier. "Effective immediately," she said. "Greg Bradley is suspended pending full review." Bradley visibly twitched, his face a mix of shock and pleading. "Please," he croaked. I can fix this." Danielle's expression didn't waver. "No, Mr. Bradley," she said. "You can't." And just like that, his fate was sealed. Danielle took in the room one final time. The passengers who had once looked at her with doubt and disdain now stood in stunned silence. Some looked ashamed, others looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the role they had played in letting this spectacle unfold. The woman in the navy blue pantsuit, the one who had earlier remained quiet despite knowing the truth, finally spoke. I should have said something," she murmured, mostly to herself. Danielle didn't react. Because it didn't matter now. The lesson had already been taught. She turned back to Reed. "I expect a full overhaul of this location's policies," she said. "Every employee will be retrained. Every incident of misconduct will be reviewed." Reed nodded immediately. "Yes, Chairwoman." "And if I find out that anything like this happens again," Danielle added, "there won't be suspensions. There will be terminations." Another nod. "Understood." Danielle let out a slow breath. It was done. The mess had been cleaned up, and justice had been served. But more importantly, a precedent had been set. Without another word, Danielle picked up her suitcase, adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, and walked away. Composed. Victorious. As if she had never been questioned at all. What do you think about this ending? Did they get what they deserved, or should Danielle have done even more? Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you love stories of unexpected justice, shocking twists, and powerful moments like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next.